Hi everyone, here's the Chemist once again, and this is the final installment in my Gravity's Rainbows reading project. And if you guys, like me, finally managed to complete Gravity's Rainbow, be it your first read, be it a reread, give yourself a pat on the shoulder because you finished a very complex and very long and very difficult book, and that's something you should be proud of. And also one of the masterpieces of the 20th century, and even most importantly, one of the most seminal books of the century. You find the influence of this book in so much of American postmodernism and in so much of the contemporary literature of the US. This book is a staple in many universities in the US, but also across the world. It's one of those books that, being so challenging, being so famous, writers usually have read, and you can find traces of it, of its themes, maybe of some of its experimental passages, maybe of some of its narrative techniques in the fiction of so many writers. Jennifer Egan's Look at Me, which I reviewed recently, is of course very Pynchonian. David Foster Wallace is probably the most famous among the writers who were heavily influenced by Pynchon in their career, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Michael Chabon, possibly my very favorite writer, is a huge Pynchon fan, and he has apparently hidden Pynchonian Easter eggs in all of his novels. But beyond that, his fiction is heavily Pynchonian, even though he writes nothing like Pynchon. His books are all very entertaining and very enjoyable, even though they're also quite complex, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that he is one of Pynchon's most interesting followers or fans, let's call them that, because he's absolutely Pynchonian but does not read at all like the original guy. And of course, Jonathan Franzen too was originally, his early novels are heavily influenced by Pynchon, and I could go on because the list is virtually endless. Before I talk about the big revelation we get in this final section in the second half of part 4, I want to address and wrap up a topic I raised in the last video about the relationship between Roger and Jessica, and about the fact that I believe part 4 of the novel and the novel in general doesn't do much justice to Jessica as a character, because she becomes sort of a shadow of herself in part 4. I'm not saying I'm changing my mind, but many of your comments were extremely interesting on that front, and I believe I may have been too harsh in my previous video, mostly because I believe that my reading of Jessica was too heavily influenced by part 4. I still believe that in part 4 only Roger's point of view is provided, and that implies a certain prominence given to the masculine character in the couple, but at the same time, as some of you pointed out, as two commenters in particular called Forrest Ray and Jesse Farmer pointed out, it is true that Jessica's perspective on their couple and the reasons why she eventually leaves Roger are actually explored very thoroughly, but they are so very early in the novel, especially I believe between part 1, maybe even in part 2. So what happens here is that if you take the novel as a whole, then definitely the relationship makes sense. This is not the novel does justice to both characters. If you read the novel, if you divide it in portions, let's say, and if you just consider the story sequentially, and if you approach the story from part 4, from the ending and from that horrible and hideous scene where Roger makes everyone puke, it seems a bit as if Roger is given prominence and as if he is the victim in that relationship, even though I very much agree with these commenters that Jessica instead, if we take the novel as a whole, is the more mature character, and she has her obvious reasons, and even though she admittedly falls back into the system and goes back to them, whoever they are, she ends up looking as the more mature character of the two. And this thing I'm saying about taking the novel as a whole is very important, because as we learn from a crucial reflection here in this final section between Blicero and Gottfried, the whole point of the novel, the whole point of this nightmarish travel through the zone. We explore some of the most hideous moments in World War II, but in Western culture in general, some of the most terrible pulsions and tensions and desires to be found in Western culture, the most self-destructive, the most dark. The whole point, the whole final point is that Western culture aims toward analysis. And that analysis is the great sin, again, of Europe. Blicero, talking about America, it's page 857 of my edition, goes, Europe had found a site for its kingdom of death, that special death the West had invented. Savages had their waste regions, Kalaharis, lakes so misty they could not see the other side. But Europe had gone deeper, into obsession, addiction, away from all the savage innocences. America was a gift from the invisible powers, a way of returning. But Europe refused it. It wasn't Europe's original sin, the latest name for that is modern analysis, but it happens that subsequent sin is harder to atone for. In Africa, Asia, Amerindia, Oceania, Europe came and established its order of analysis and death. What it could not use, it killed or altered. And this is a crucial reflection in Gravity's Rainbow, and it's very paradoxical because it comes at the end of an 8-video series on YouTube, whose purpose admittedly is to sort of analyze Gravity's Rainbow. The point here is that analysis, which separates a whole into parts in order to understand them, and as the novel very clearly puts it, trying to understand something already means turning it approaching it from a utilitarian perspective. Myself too, I admit, my purpose from the beginning was to try and make the experience more enlightening and more fun for me in the first place, and hopefully for someone else. But there's an evil there, because it takes again something that is whole and it splits it into parts, and by so doing it denies the unity of everything, which is of course one of the key concepts in Gravity's Rainbow and the key concepts in postmodernism. It is declined, postmodern thought I mean, it is declined in political terms, in spiritual terms, in literary terms, that idea that everything is connected in the end. And see how this also parallels Jessica and Roger's reflection, and if you approach that reflection from a single point, which is Roger's, as part 4 does, the relation, you know, you only get his point and Jessica loses her nature as a full-fledged character, whereas if you consider it as a whole, you get to see both of their sides, and eventually you realize probably Jessica has the right in that relationship. And I now wonder if Pynchon was fucking with us in terms of the relationship too. What I believe is clear, and this I also got from a brilliant text on Gravity's Rainbow and on Pynchon's early novels called The Fictional Labyrinths of Thomas Pynchon by a scholar called David Seed. The point there, the point with Gravity's Rainbow is that it plays with the reader. It defies, as all novels usually do, it defies readers to analyze it, to make sense of it, only to teach readers how perverse that process can be. In that sense, it pulls that same trick that Infinite Jest, remember David Foster Wallace as a Pynchon fan, Infinite Jest also does, which is to comment upon the addictiveness of entertainment by providing a form of entertainment that is quite addictive. A story, a novel that many people, me included when I first read it, just can't put down. At the beginning of another section in these final pages, we get the author addressing the reader and going, you will want cause and effect, okay, and it goes on to explain what happened to a character. The novel in this sense again is skeptical of these sort of straightforward explanations, of trying to analyze and make sense of things. It identifies that there's a form of, once again, of perversion behind that tendency, a desire once more toward control, another one of the key terms in this novel. Is all of this exaggerated? This idea that, you know, looking for meaning in a story is somehow evil, is it exaggerated? Of course it is, of course it definitely is. This is 100% as paranoid a novel as some of its characters are, and I do believe that in this basic frustration in the novel, wishing somehow to punish the reader for their wishes and establishing such an antagonistic stance with the reader, this is very different from some later Pynchon novels. This should not be taken at all as an example of everything Pynchon has to offer, and I'm saying this mostly because I took it for one when I originally read Gravity's Rainbow, and I didn't read Pynchon for several years until eventually I discovered that the Pynchon I love, the Pynchon whose novels I could read again and again, is actually the later one from, let's say, from Mason and Dixon onward. In later novels, stuff such as Against the Day, Bleeding Edge, maybe those novels too can be frustrating, some of their mysteries are still unresolved, and Pynchon also makes points about certain wishes and certain tensions being somewhat evil, or tied at least to the dynamics of power and control, but I do not think that any of those books punishes the reader willingly the way Gravity's Rainbow does. That's not to say that it's all hell with part 4, far from it, even though, of course, certain scenes here, especially the scenes around the Schwarzgerät getting fired, especially considering that that scene is dragged through section after section, those ones are truly hellish, are among the most nightmarish scenes and moments we read in Gravity's Rainbow, very disturbing stuff, but at the same time the conclusion, even just because of the sheer architectural beauty of the novel going back to its beginning, and the final song being so beautiful and poignant, whatever it means, all of that is very rewarding. I do firmly believe that Gravity's Rainbow, and let me know if you felt the same, I don't know what percentage of the novel I actually got, whether it was like 2%, 50%, I have no idea, but I still found the ending very rewarding, both the first time I read it and this final time. Also, it's one of those passages I keep going back to very often. Very often I'll just reread the last 2 pages of the novel. And also, finally, the beauty of part 4 was made explicit in a comment to my last video from This Is Fractopia, and it's a very good comment, and I'm going to read it in its entirety because I liked it very much. Part 4 is brilliant and risky and true to life. You think you have a grand narrative, but as life goes on, the lines get clouded and your grand narrative picks up static in the form of orthogonal intrusions, until eventually it falls into a pile of sticks, and then the sticks get pounded into the mud, and eventually it's impossible to even figure out what you thought the grand narrative was anymore. For an author to do this with his own novel is one of the ballsiest acts of creative writing ever performed. I very much agree, and I believe that gives us an insight, a further insight into the genius of Gravity's Rainbow. I hope you enjoyed this reading project, guys. Some of you mentioned that you maybe were not able to finish the novel, but that you might watch these videos in the future when you do that. And I hope they're going to be at least a tiny bit useful, even that they're just going to give you that extra support. Maybe you need to stick through it and reach the end. And if this was your first reading, please believe me that the novel is so much more rewarding upon reread. The first time I finished this book, I swore to myself I liked it in a way. Again, I adored the ending, but I swore that I would never reread it because it was such a disturbing experience. And at times during my reread, I found myself thinking the same, going, okay, this is great, but I'm not ever going to do this again. This is too painful. And so I'm not going to say anything, but we'll see. And thank you again for watching all of these videos. Probably soon I'm going to post a review of Gravity's Rainbow where I talk about the novel without spoilers. Maybe I discuss it in broader terms, and I recommend people whether they should read it or not. You know, a review, as those things usually go, but we'll see about that. And thank you again. Bye, guys.